talking about the big fella, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, known by many names around the world, seen by thousands, tens of thousands of people in different kinds of situations, in particular in the Pacific Northwest. There have been documentaries and TV shows about Bigfoot for a long time. Haven't seen any really impressive ones until this next film that we're going to talk about. The two guests that are coming up, Tobe Johnson and Brett Eichenberger, have put together a masterpiece. We're going to jump right into it, talking about the search for Bigfoot. A Flash of Beauty, Bigfoot Revealed is the name of the movie, and we're going to get right into it right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Is Bigfoot real? Is he Mother Nature's son, as that song just suggested? That is, an undiscovered or unacknowledged primate species living in wild places around the planet, places like the Pacific Northwest in North America here. Or is he something else, something not quite flesh and blood as we understand it? We're going to get into that and try to attack some of those questions in a moment. I guess the answer depends on who you ask. You know, there are a lot of Bigfoot TV shows, sort of like UFO TV shows, some good ones, some not so good. Lots of greenish video of people stumbling around in the darkness of forests, making funny noises. The film we're about to discuss is nothing like those. It's scenic, professional, highly persuasive, too, with first-hand stories and accounts from people who've seen these beings up close, often more than once. Tobe Johnson is the author of the Owl Moon Lab books, a researcher of all things related to Bigfoot with more than a decade of research and his own experiences. He's dedicated his work to investigating the relationship of Sasquatch and the paranormal. He is the co-producer of the documentary Flash of Beauty, Bigfoot Revealed, which is the film we're about to talk about. Brett Eichenberger is an award-winning filmmaker with over 25 years of experience working on film and video production. Work includes feature films, commercials, short films, music videos, and documentary shorts. He'll have to go a long way to do a better job than what we're going to hear about now. Gentlemen, Brett, Tobe, welcome to the program.
George, thank you for having us. This is quite the honor, I've got to say, and your praise is really incredible. Thank you so much.
Well, I really enjoyed it. It's a film of beauty, first and foremost. I mean, it's not something you just threw together. You guys really spent some time. You take your time in telling the story. You let it breathe a little bit, and it starts with these powerful testimonials from people who have seen this and who they don't have to argue with them about whether it's real or not. They know it's real. They've seen it up close. I don't know where you got some of the older footage, but maybe you can start there. Tell me how you started working on this.
Yeah, so this is a project that really kind of was developed from the pandemic. Jill Remensnyder and myself, Jill was the producer on the film, and myself, we had always wanted to make a Bigfoot documentary after growing up in Oregon. And, you know, this is something that goes back to our childhoods. And being filmmakers, we had other projects that we were working on, narrative scripted projects. And so when the pandemic hit, we had some connections in the Bigfoot world. And so we thought, you know what, this is a great opportunity for us to social distance and get out in the woods and really start working on this documentary. And originally, we had planned to spend about 6 to 7 months putting it together. And as we started meeting folks and getting their stories, and we found out that there was a lot more to this story than we had initially expected. And we ended up discovering a whole bunch about Bigfoot that was quite a surprise, I got to say.
Well, I've read a lot, and we've interviewed a lot of guys who've chased the mystery over the years on this program. You know, and there are those for whom no amount of evidence will ever convince them it's real. I don't need a whole lot more. I know that there's something there based on the kinds of stories that you got from these witnesses. And you start with testimony from Yakima tribe members, and then goes on to other Native American stories. I don't know which of you wants to start there, but is it your impression that the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples, have more of a relationship with whatever this species is than we will ever achieve?
Yeah, I think, George, I think we can both answer that question. Yes, absolutely. That's the native collection. The native connection is where we start, because we're talking about relationships with tribes up and down the West Coast and for the most part across the United States, relationships that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so that was something that we definitely wanted to get into. And some of these relationships are very close. And one of the tribes that's based up in British Columbia on Vancouver Island, they believe they might actually have some Sasquatch DNA in them. And we briefly mentioned that. I wish that we could have dedicated an entire documentary to the Native connection, because it is very strong and a huge part of their cultures.
Well, I think you probably find some people who wonder if Bigfoot, Sasquatch, has human DNA as well. As I hadn't heard that humans may have Bigfoot DNA, but that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it really is.
The Yakima tribe. So, that area has always been a hotbed for Bigfoot stuff, but also for a lot of other paranormal phenomena, UFOs. We don't have to get into that right now, but it's like the Native Americans seem to have an understanding of things that the rest of us have either forgotten or never knew.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. And a lot of them, we talk about this in the film quite a bit. A lot of them will keep it close to their chest, and that's important to their culture. And so, we were honored to have Mel Skahan. I know Mel's been on the show a couple of times, I believe, but we were honored to have Mel talk to us about some of the discoveries that he's made on the Yakima Reservation, and including, finding 3-inch multicolored, I think he almost said that they were like rainbow-colored fur that he found in a nest, of all places. But you're exactly right, George. The sightings in and around the Mount Adams area of all things paranormal is legendary. So we definitely had to focus on that part of the world.
The Yakima, the Uni, I think you mentioned, the Yakut Nation, they all seem to have a slightly different version, but they all speak of him as a brother, right? I mean, some kind of a brother, a creature of the forest that's related to them, if not by blood, but at least as brotherhood in that manner.
Yes, it's that is very true. In some of the cultures, in other cultures, it's a little bit different. Some of the tribes I know look at Sasquatch as kind of a mischievous cousin or a trickster, but obviously they all have different, relationships, and some of that I think depends on region. We've had many reports of different personalities depending on where you're at. Say for instance, if you're in the Mount St. Helens area, they can be a little bit more aggressive than they might be around the Mount Rainier area. So there is that fact too, and I think a lot of folks out there might just think that Bigfoot is kind of a one-dimensional being, if you will, and a lot of the media out there kind of portrays them as being aggressive, but that's certainly not the case based on the eyewitness accounts that we've heard and some of the folks that we interview in this film.
Also in your film, you go to Phenomicon, the event that was held, I guess it was held this year too, but last year, Jeff Meldrum is speaking there. Dr. Jeff Meldrum, an anthropologist, maybe the foremost academic who's been out front about being interested in Bigfoot for a long time. He's a brave man. I mean, he's a brave guy to be able to stand up and say, yeah, I'm investigating this. I think it is an unknown, unacknowledged bipedal primate, right?
Yes, correct. And Dr. Meldrum was a very busy guy. We were able to squeeze in an interview with him at Phenomicon, and we are definitely indebted to Dr. Meldrum for doing that. He has some very good points in this film, and I think that one of the major points that he makes goes back to the famous Patterson-Gimlin film. Ironically enough, I was actually at the site yesterday with Jill Remsnide, the producer. And what we found from visiting that site was, number one, it would have been really hard to have gone to all that effort with a suit to get that footage. And Dr. Meldrum talks about that quite a bit. He also talks about the technology back in the day as to where the Academy Award-winning makeup designers were with ape costume designs versus the suit that we're now able to really break down with technology and see muscles moving and to really push in on the back of the neck. Henry Franzoni talks about that quite a bit in the documentary as well, about how they tried to debunk it in the late 90s. They were given $500,000 in the late 90s trying to debunk this. They couldn't do it.
Who put
So
up the
yeah,
money?
Dr. Meldrum does a lot of
Yeah.
he has a lot of great points.
Now tell me that story. Who put up the money to try to debunk it, and what were the findings?
So the findings was that it was an uncatalogued animal. I don't recall off the top of my head who the benefactor was that put up that money. I believe it was someone that was working in conjunction with Henry and with Peter Byrne, but I don't have too many details on that.
But at least the analysis turned out to be you couldn't fake this, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And they went at it with science. I mean, these weren't guys that went into it thinking, yeah, we know it's a Sasquatch, but we're doing our due diligence. That wasn't the case at all. They went through and they tried to debunk it. And as technology gets better, and as we're able to zoom into that 16 millimeter film, we're seeing details that we've never seen before, details that we didn't know that we could see. And that's what's really exciting to me as somebody that really loves the technology, is to see how they're able to break this down. And as time goes by, the footage gets more and more real.
But it's still the only real great footage that exists. Why, when people say, why isn't there more? What do you tell them?
You know, that's a great question, and that's kind of the question that everybody has. You know, I think there's some other pieces of footage out there that are pretty decent, but there's nothing like the Patterson-Gimlin film. I believe unequivocally that is 100% genuine. That is a Bigfoot in the flesh. You know, they're great at, I think, sensing people. I definitely think that they have senses that obviously humans don't have. I think that they might be able to sense the frequency of cameras. They might be able to hear, the mechanism. It's really a great question.
Give me sort of the laundry list of the state of evidence for Bigfoot now. I know that Dr. Meldrum kind of rattles off of it a little bit, but Brett, maybe you want to jump into this. How much solid evidence do we have, and what can we prove for sure?
We don't have a lot of solid evidence, and Tobe can jump in here as well. But, what I can say is that there have been some DNA tests done. And a lot of those DNA tests come back with human contamination. There's, and Dr. Meldrum talks about how the footprint is some of the best evidence that we have because of the way that the foot is shaped. In order to fake that, you would have to have a pretty advanced knowledge of, a primate foot and how that foot would work. So obviously we don't have a body, at least not in mainstream science yet. We can get into that later, but I think as far as hard evidence goes, we do, like I said, we do have the Patterson-Gimlin film, and we do have a couple other pieces of maybe evidence as far as hair samples and DNA.
Well, I think the footprints and these casts of footprints from all over the world, thousands of them, is pretty solid evidence that something really big with gigantic feet is floating around out there. And I know that there have been people who've tried to fake these things, but the fakes don't hold up under scrutiny, do they?
No, they don't. Eventually, an expert's going to come along and they're going to debunk the fakes. There's some fakes out there that are better than others, of course. And some people do their homework, and other folks, they just want to prank people, and sometimes those pranks get carried away. That certainly happens.
Tobe, the prints that get to me the most are ones that you find in the middle of nowhere, not on some path where road workers are bound to see it, but somewhere up on the top of a mountain ridge where nobody ever climbs, and there they are, out in the middle of nowhere. If somebody's trying to prank people, that wouldn't be the place to put them, would they?
Well, I'm always surprised at what people will do, but getting to the meat and potatoes of what you're describing, being on site when you actually see a track that's stamped into something like the duff of the forest at a 90-degree angle, a couple inches deep, at that point, you're left without question that something with direct pressure has left that undoubtedly large impression. So it's difficult to explain how that's done when you can't duplicate it.
Tobe, tell me this, as a guy working on this film, how tough is it to get like the Lakotas or other First Nations people to open up and be honest about Sasquatch stories? Because a lot of it, as you relate in the film, they're passed down from grandfather to grandson, generation to generation by word of mouth. They're not written down there, and they don't share it with outsiders.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, it takes time to get to know First Nations people, and a lot of people aren't willing to wait for that time to develop. In one case, there was a gal out of Kalapuya tribe that I was getting to know, and it took some time to address Sasquatch with her. In fact, it took a couple seasons to even bring up the name Sasquatch with this elder, and that's just because of the reverence to the Sasquatch being themselves. So in that case, you have to sit back and just kind of wait.
You do a great job of weaving in historical information, telling a story about this 1840s missionary who heard tales from the tribes about these smelly wild men who were very strong, and they'd come down out of the mountains or out of the forest to take salmon. When we come back, I want to jump into that story. Tell me who this missionary was, because he wrote about this race of giants and what kind of information you gleaned from that. We're talking with the producers of this new film, A Flash of Beauty, Bigfoot Revealed, Tobe Johnson and Brett Eichenberger. I'm going to jump into some of the specifics of what they found out. They went way back to the beginning of the legend, interviewed concurrent witnesses whose personal encounters are very powerful. What might it be? A flesh and blood animal or something else? We're going to get into that in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Brett and Tobe, you mentioned that you started this film during the COVID period when you had time to be out in the woods and social distance. Can you tell me what, you both had a long time interest in the topic. What did you have in mind for this film to separate it from anything else that had been done on the subject? Brett, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so what was important to me, George, getting started on this film was really getting into the emotional impact of Bigfoot witnesses. And this is something that we hadn't seen, and we took a look at most of the documentaries that were out there. And for me, I feel like the emotional accounts are extremely good evidence. A lot of these folks are seeing something that is completely bending their reality upside down. And we're talking about some folks that have had post-traumatic stress disorder type symptoms after seeing something that, quote unquote, does not exist. And so I thought there was something to that. I'm not going to lie. Earlier today, I was driving a mountain road to get where I'm at right now, and I made eye contact with a bear about 40 feet from our car. And the adrenaline rush was intense. Multiply that by 100 times. I knew what it was. I knew it was a predator, but I also knew I could run to safety. When somebody sees these things and they see them up close, it really strikes a fear into them. And it's not something that they ever forget. In fact, it just completely changes their lives. And so we wanted to concentrate on that. And we went so far as to talk to a psychologist and a hypnotherapist about how the brain functions and why it processes the information the way that it does. And it turns out that when somebody experiences something traumatic, they record it in their brains like a VHS recorder. And a hypnotherapist, for instance, can go back frame by frame and help that person recall that encounter, recall the details. And they can kind of go backwards and remember what it looked like and how they were feeling. And that really helps out with the therapy.
It seemed like what came across from the witnesses, and I agree, the witnesses, is that those stories are the most powerful part of the film. But what comes across to me is a sense of awe and wonder. And I didn't get a sense that any of them had any PTSD, that it had affected their lives in profound ways, but that it was a positive experience overall. And I thought what you guys did with the interviews, and Tobe, you can jump in here, you allowed people to tell their stories at their own pace. You didn't try to cram it all in or chop it all up. Allowed them to tell it at their ease, and it really came across as powerful. Tobe?
To that question here about someone's reality ultimately shifting based on their sighting, it's never really been done before, at least not in a Bigfoot documentary, not this way. And to be a part of that process, not only being interviewed, but watching other people go through the motion on screen, looking, at the camera, dead center, explaining those stories, some stories in which they've never even told their spouse about, or their mother, or their father, or their hunting partner. These things change people ultimately for good. And that's something to capture on camera.
You had two guys who were out in the woods making a survival video, going to put it on YouTube, and they had an encounter. They didn't get footage, but you can see that they were stunned. They were still stunned, maybe years later, telling a story.
Yeah, Chad and Austin, great guys. Those are a couple of guys that I think had that kind of borderline PTSD. Now, Austin's a veteran. He served over in Iraq, I believe, and what he experienced in combat was second to what he experienced that day, looking across that lake at that Bigfoot. And those two guys will never be the same because of that sighting. And what they witnessed, I thought, was so profound because they saw an adult Bigfoot take a child or a juvenile and shield it and protect it when they saw the humans. And for me, that really touched me, and it really touched him. It really touched Chad as a father, and touched Austin, and Austin works with special needs kids. And so, those guys were really moved by that experience. But at the same time, they were afraid of the ridicule. They were afraid of what people would say. And so, it took them a while to really come forward, and we really had to kind of coax them in order to come out there and revisit that spot and tell the story, standing literally on the bank that they were standing on when they saw it 6 months prior.
You have this historical piece, these 1840s missionary who eventually hears stories from tribal members about this smelly wild man, very strong, who would come down out of the forest and take salmon. And I guess the guy wrote about it, labeling it as a superstition about this race of giants. Which of you wants to jump into that and share more about that story?
Yeah, share the specifics on that, Brett.
Yeah. So that was Elkanah Walker, and Elkanah Walker was a missionary from the East Coast. He was from New England, as a matter of fact, and he was kind of stationed, I guess you could call it, up near Spokane, Washington, when he wrote this letter back to a friend of his, another reverend on the East Coast, and described these. He kind of apologized almost for saying, pardon me for these superstitions, or bear with me as. And then he goes into these accounts that are right out of modern day tales. I mean, he nails all of it. He nails the smell. He nails the foot size. Everything is there. It's eerie. It's very eerie, but the letter, I assure you, is real. It's authentic. I believe it's on the East Coast in possibly at Yale University. I'm not quite sure. But that piece really struck me when I heard it and when I read it. And he does such a good job of really getting into the details of that. So that was something that we knew at the very beginning we wanted to feature, to show that this is not a phenomenon that started in 1967 with Patterson Gimlin film. This is a phenomenon that started, hundreds of years ago with some of the first settlers.
Yeah, there are those who like to argue that it's all a product of television and films, that they've created the mythology, and so people see it out there when they're actually just seeing a bear or a moose or something. But these stories have been around a long time all over the world. I remember there's a Teddy Roosevelt encounter somewhere where it sure sounds like it's a Sasquatch that he runs into. It wasn't created by television. These people were seeing these things for a long time before TV came along.
Yeah,
right?
That's exactly right. And that's exactly why we wanted to start off with the natives, and we wanted to say that, this was not something that was just part of their cultural beliefs. This was a flesh and blood part of their cultural beliefs. It had a profound, I think it has a profound effect on cultures, their cultures to this day. The Sasquatch and the Bigfoot is still very sacred to them.
There's a guy you interview for the film called named Henry Franzoni who worked with tribes for years as a conservationist, I guess. And over time, he gains their trust. He starts hearing the stories they don't tell generally outside the tribe. And I think he's the one that first reveals about Vancouver Island, that there's a secret society within the tribe. I don't know what you want to pick up the story there, but tell us what you found from what Henry told us.
Yeah, Tobe, maybe that's something you could go into detail on.
Well, regarding Henry Franzoni, he's a lesser known Bigfooter, unfortunately, but he runs in the same school as the people like Ron Moorhead or Tom Powell. And he was a mentor of mine early on since the mid 2000s, and following up on his work, including his book, The Spirit of Siatka, which basically goes over the mystical nature of Sasquatch, not only from the First Nations people, but also explains, the idea behind place names on a map. These places are looked at as places you should go to maybe look for Sasquatch that have names like Skookum or Wendigo, Bigfoot, obviously, and Sasquatch. And that's how Henry initiated his own sighting based on doing that. But getting to know the First Nations people up in British Columbia, he did go over some of the details about a secret society up there that I believe still might practice some sort of cannibalism and look at Sasquatch in a more puzzling, devious nature.
As a brother, or as something to hunt, or something to emulate?
Well, I think in particular it's the Tonaqua, which is the whistling woman of the woods, or the basket woman, to put the the children in the basket and carry them off, which gets into a different territory of maybe missing 411 and what's actually happening here with some of our youth.
Another interview that I thought was key. I'm surprised I don't know this name of Peter Byrne, but he was terrific. And I guess you tell the story that he was in the Himalayas looking for Yeti. I don't know if he saw one there, but he got hooked. And then he comes to the Pacific Northwest and he becomes sort of an authority. Tell me about him.
Peter Byrne is a legend in the Bigfoot world. And yeah, he came over in the 1970s, as he says in the documentary. An oil tycoon by the name of Tom Slick invites him over and says, I'm gonna fund your research. And Peter set up shop in the Dalles, Oregon, which is just east of Mount Hood, and went to work. They set up a hotline when you had Bigfoot encounters, and Peter started to work with Henry Franzoni, and they had a bunch of folks out there with them, and when they got a call, they went and they did the research. And Peter started off as a big game hunter and was extremely good at tracking large animals such as, tigers, lions, elephants. Peter told me a story about how an elephant could be 3 feet away from you, you wouldn't hear it. And so he used those developed senses to really get out there and track Sasquatch. Now, for Peter, the Sasquatch, the Bigfoot, remained elusive, and he never did have a sighting, but he was always 100% convinced.
I think the point you make in the film, it might be from one of the witnesses one of the female witnesses who said that basically they decide who gets to see them. They allow you to see it, and if they don't want you to see it, you won't. Agree?
Absolutely, and I know Tobe can talk a little bit more about this, but Chad and Austin mentioned this. People say, well, here, you're up there with your cameras doing YouTube survival videos, and you didn't get the Bigfoot on camera. And we go into that, in detail. But in short, they believe that had they had their cameras with them on that bank, on the shore of that lake, that they would not have been seen. Like, it was almost kind of an indoctrination to a certain extent.
George, there seems to be something with Sasquatch and your intent, a measuring device on what your intent is when you come into the tree line. Not always the tree line, but per se out here in the Pacific Northwest, if you have intention to sneak up or deploy any electronics for that matter, but especially there seems to be a permission slip with cameras. And that's that's non-negotiable, even with the apers in the community. There's something to that, and it's time we start looking at it.
Yeah, there's a guy named Scott Tompkins, and he runs something called the Bigfoot Mapping Project. I'd never heard of this before, but he's using mapping techniques to sort of catalog, become a central repository for cases and sightings and data. Did that start? Did you know about that before you did this film? And is it up and running?
Yes, it's definitely up and running. You can go there and you can read reports. You can file reports with BigfootMap.com. And Scott is a cartographer who had a not really a sighting, but he kind of had an experience in upstate New York when he was a teenager. And so that got him interested in Bigfoot. And so he thought it would be interesting to take that data and start quantifying that data. And that's what interests me, is because I feel like when you take a look at a map and you see, and we show this in the film, you see all these dots appear in the map. And, there's different dots for whether it was a track, whether it was a sound, or whether it was a full-blown sighting. But when you see all this data, you have to ask yourself, not every single one of those is something other than a Bigfoot. So in other words, if you eliminated all of them, we would have an issue, But there's definitely something going on there. There's definitely, they can't all be wrong. So, and I love what Scott's doing, and he's getting more and more detailed as the technology develops. He also has an iPhone and Android app, too, that I would highly recommend downloading. So you can have it in the field. If you see something, you can get all the details right down.
Oh, well, good. I hope we bring some attention, and your film brings some attention to what he's doing, because there needs to be a central repository for that. I can't remember, and in previous interviews we've done about Sasquatch, it seems like they've been seen pretty much in every state in the country. I'm not sure about Hawaii, but it's possible. We even had them, you think they have to live in forests, but we had a sighting at the Nevada test site in the late 70s out at the nuclear test site, where you wouldn't think that they'd show up, or how could they possibly hide? And that sighting made me think that maybe there's something more than a flesh and blood animal that lives in the forest. We can get into that on the other side. We're going to take a break now, talking with Tobe Johnson and Brett Eichenberger about A Flash of Beauty, their Bigfoot film. We're talking with Tobe Johnson and Brett Eichenberger about their brilliant new film, A Flash of Beauty, Bigfoot Revealed. Beautiful stuff, great, powerful testimony from eyewitnesses. We're going to hear some of those stories in this, and then also delve into the paranormal aspects. Those do pop up from time to time. A lot of folks, academics in particular, are comfortable with the idea that Bigfoot might be a flesh and blood animal, but a lot of Bigfoot researchers are not comfortable mixing in other weird stuff, paranormal stuff. It's, they figure it's tough enough to go after this undiscovered primate without mixing other weird stuff in there to muddy the reputations of those who pursue this. We'll talk about that, and then we'll take some of your phone calls here in our final hour of Coast to Coast AM. Included in your film are a couple of accounts of people who've had multiple encounters with Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and some who indicate, or at least hint, that maybe they have an ongoing relationship, that they've seen them multiple times in the same locations, and they don't really want to tell where those locations are so they don't screw things up. Brett, share with us what your thoughts are. Can humans develop a trusting relationship with these things?
Yes, absolutely, George. A woman that we interviewed, Arla Williams, has had a relationship with multiple Bigfoot or Sasquatch for, almost 60 years. I mean, this goes back to her childhood when she was kind of playing outside. She looked up, she saw a hairy little kid. And that hairy little kid was a juvenile Bigfoot. And as it turns out, her grandmother had had some of the same experiences. And Arla has developed a language with them that she can communicate with them back and forth. And we don't talk about this much in the film, and there's a reason why that we don't get into the paranormal in this particular film. And that reason is because we decided to make two films. And so we've got a second film coming out called The Paranormal Bigfoot, which gets into some of this stuff. But basically, Arla is able to do what's called mind speak. And and she can communicate with them back and forth, either using, they'll send her words in her head that she'll hear, but it won't be her own voice, her internal voice, or she'll see pictures. And she does this on a very regular basis. It's phenomenal. But this phenomenon is not something that just happens to folks that have relationships with Bigfoot. This is something that happens with folks that might just be at the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time. Many people, first-timers, will have these experiences, sometimes even without a sighting. So it's very interesting, getting this data from across the country of these exact same things happening to so many different people.
Well, I've heard a lot of stories over the years of people who put things out for them, like apples, treats, different kinds of things, offerings almost, to get them to come back. You don't always see them when they come and take it, but that they develop some sort of a relationship. It's rare, but it happens, I guess. Tobe? Or Brett, you want to talk about that?
Oh, yeah. So basically what happens is folks will put out any number of things, from food to trinkets to, things that have special value or that they know might, attract more Bigfoot, like, for instance, marbles are a popular one. And this is something that we get into quite a bit in the second film. And this is something that Tobe can kind of elaborate on, some of his gifting exchanges that he's had in the past, and some of the extraordinary things that that they've left for him and for some of his friends.
Tobe, do you want to talk about that?
Sorry about that. I had you on mute here. Absolutely. A lot of people call these types of experiencers habituators. I like to call them extended experiencers, people that quite literally have Bigfoot in their own backyard. And oftentimes these kind of experiences are initiated with items that are left in strange places, strange locations, strange times of days for specific people. And these objects can be small, they can be large. Oftentimes they have a patina to them, as though they've been found in a dump. And we talk a little bit about that in the documentary, about a group of Sasquatch that come in and out of a city dump. And when it comes to one of the cases here in the little town of Cottage Grove, Oregon, that's exactly what these little items looked like. They had a mossy, muddy patina to them, as though they'd been found in a campsite or an abandoned area and placed in unusual spots. And so this initiation, or this back and forth of trading objects with, God knows what, you suspect Sasquatch, but you really don't know, seems to amp up activity to the point where you start finding more and more evidence. And that's where the forensic part of Sasquatch comes in, like the handprints or the hair or the footprints. And so that's been my experience.
You guys both know the name Melba Ketchum, I'm sure. Melba's been my guest a couple times on the show, and I guess now in the eyes of a lot of Bigfoot people, she's discredited because she had put together this study of Bigfoot hair samples, and the analysis came back and showed there's human DNA in this, which was a reason for a lot of people to toss it out. That raises a pretty interesting series of speculations about human DNA mixed with some unknown DNA. Melba is a habituator. She says that there's a place in Texas, I guess, where she goes and sees them all the time. But where did the testing of DNA, of hair and DNA samples, where does that stand these days? Brett, any thoughts?
Tobe might actually have more details.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Well, when it comes to the DNA testing, it keeps coming back as being contaminated with human DNA, especially on the male side, the female side. The male side is still something of a mystery. But, as long as the chain of custody is wrapped up tight, and we tried to do that ourselves along the way here as well, as far as collecting evidence, when it comes back as being contaminated over and over again, or the hair samples disappear, the skin samples disappear, at what point do you say maybe DNA isn't the best option here for us to look at? So, if you can have an experience and you can actually start initiating contact here, tantamount to something like a CE5 experiment a la Greer, maybe you can start learning how to interact with these things full time. And so that's kind of been my angle.
Just seems to me that if you have a hair sample and it has human DNA mixed with unknown DNA, maybe it's not contamination. Maybe it's because both of those DNA are together in the same being. But you guys are the experts. There's a story you tell in the film about a guy who's out. He was with military doing some military exercises with explosives. They have 3 explosions that they set off. They're riding in a Humvee. They go to the second blast site and they see. What do they see? They see 3 of them, right?
Yeah, that's correct. That's Todd Neese's sighting, and that happened in the northern Oregon Coast Range, close to about 30 years ago now. That's a remarkable sighting because of the dangerous work that they were doing. I think that really threw Todd off to see these, what he first thought were people, but to see these creatures standing there over this smoking crater, and they're doing this strange thing that's often reported with Bigfoot sightings is their arms are swaying back and forth. One of them in this case was solid, but the other 2, their arms are swaying back and forth. And so we don't know, but what I've wondered if that's some sort of indication of them being uncomfortable in a situation, or if maybe it's a spiritual situation. I'm not quite sure, but that really is a powerful encounter because of the nature of the encounter. And I would personally think that those loud explosives would scare anything and everything far, far away from those detonations. But that was not the case.
It sounded like these things showed up to go, what the heck are you doing out here in the forest? Knock it off.
Yeah.
And luckily it didn't kill any of them that we know of.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. There's a theory that, and even Henry Franzoni he'd take his drum kit out into the forest, and he would do some drumming, and he would think that would attract them. And there's a lot of folks out there that believe that making noise and doing things kind of spikes their curiosity and brings them to the edge of the woods, if not even further.
There's another story you have in the film as told by a guy who goes camping. He takes his dog. He pitches a tent out there. Suddenly he wakes up in the middle of the night. He hears something walking around him, and it actually grabs his head through the tent, right? Maybe one of you can tell that story?
Yeah, that's Larry Turner, and Larry has had 7 different sightings. And that's not one of them because he didn't see it that night, but he was scared to death, as anybody would be, but he felt this giant hand, the back of his head. Later on, after he finally fell asleep and woke up the next morning, he discovered that the Bigfoot had removed some eggs very carefully out of his cooler.
And his dog jumped into his sleeping bag, right? Tore him up, scratched him all up?
Scratched him to pieces, as Larry says in the documentary. Yeah, it's quite an encounter, and every encounter and sighting that Larry has been just as interesting as the last.
We'll try to take one call on this side of the break. East of the Rockies, Dennis in Brooklyn. Hey, Dennis, good morning. You're on with Tobe and Brett.
Hi, George. I just want to say quickly I'm a big fan of yours. Your programs are always awesome, and your musical knowledge is also awesome.
Thank you.
I wanted to bring up something very important as far as the whole idea of or question about, is this a purely physical being, or is this a being that has other properties? The usual term is extra-dimensional. There was a previous guest on Coast to Coast. Unfortunately, I forgot his name. He's a Border Patrol agent that wrote a book on his experiences as a night. He was a night Border Patrol agent. He was a guest on Coast to Coast, so it should be very easy to access who he was. But he had a lot of very interesting stories related to paranormal and to the Bigfoot thing. Number one, all parallel to the experiences of people tracking Bigfoot in snow, where the tracks just suddenly disappear, where there's no way that you can move without leaving a track in deep snow. They found people track tracks in the Border Patrol tracks in the sand, which the same thing happened, same phenomenon. They disappeared. But the particular anecdote that really opens up things is one where one night this agent was on patrol, and they would hear things and hear splashing, but they could see nothing. And then they got a call from they had agents, in the various areas of patrolling the border from some other location that told them that there was a large predator in the area and to get out of the area immediately. And they said that Border Patrol agents don't talk a lot about what goes on or what. So it wasn't until a year later that he was talking with some agent. They were at some grouping, and they were talking about it. And he said he knew the agent that had given them the warning. And this agent had a thermal imaging camera, and he got his heat signature from a very large physical being that also was bipedal. And I think the fact that this was from a thermal imaging camera, although we can perhaps go down and track who the agent was with the camera, this is anecdotal. But for those of us who believe this person's agent, that this was again kind of an indication that this is a being with extra dimensional power, since they did not see it, they could not see this, but it was viewed with a heat signature.
All right, let's get a reaction from our guests here. Tobe or Brett, have you guys heard, are you familiar with this story?
Familiar a little bit with the story, but the phenomena is something that just won't go away, as far as something in the woods, something in the desert, something that you can't see right in plain sight. It should be, at least, and cameras don't seem to solve the problem. We can go through a list of how this phenomena works, but let's just talk about the footprints in particular, the footprints that go to nowhere. Where do the footprints end? It gets into uncomfortable answers for a lot of people, especially in snowdrifts in the middle of prairies, when footprints just suddenly stop. I've heard people describe, believe in more traditional science, that Sasquatch is capable of walking backwards out of their footprints so precisely that they leave no mistakes when they do that. Now, I would give that a little bit of credence for maybe 20 or 30 yards, but when you're talking hundreds, if not thousands of yards with tracks, that gets into a whole different type of phenomena.
Yeah.
I think there's something else we need to look at.
Border Patrol, you would think that there were some stories from those guys who work for that outfit. Also, BLM, they're out there, the U.S. Forest Service, BLM, they're out on the open public ranges and forests and deserts and things. You would think that some of them see it. You mentioned in your film a BLM map that was made, that it was only rumored to exist for a long time. Can one of you tell that story?
Well, I can take that one, too, if you don't mind, Brett. Regarding that map, I was given a copy of that map myself by a guy that lived pretty much in the same area as the witness that Brett interviewed. And that map is directly from the BLM, as far as I know, and it dictates all the way from northern Oregon down to southern Oregon on the coastline. And it has a key attached to it. It describes 5 different types of sightings, including tracks, unusual sounds, firsthand sightings, things of that. But these maps are rarely given to employees that have sightings. The way I got the map was through interviewing a witness outside of Elkton, Oregon, that had a sighting, and he was given the map in secrecy by one of the secretaries, who kind of waited for him to get off the shift and handed him the map, and found myself interviewing the guy, listening to his testimony, and he gave me a copy of this supposed BLM official map. A couple of days later, after he gave me the map, I got a phone call or a message on my voicemail from his son saying his dad gave me something he shouldn't give it to me, and he needs that map back or he's going to get fired. So, yeah, people take this stuff serious.
So I wonder if you were to send a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request to BLM and ask for the map, what would happen?
That's a great question, George. And I just want to jump in here real quick and say that I think that, just to expand on this, I think that they are very well aware of these things. We do interview an Oregon Fish and Wildlife officer who talks about how he has gone out and calls, Bigfoot-related calls, and he has determined that in some of those circumstances it was not a bear that had left the evidence, which was a very interesting answer to me. So Yeah, it's. I think you could probably do the Freedom of Information Act, and I think the results would be, haha, this is an office joke or something, or what have you. I have this gut feeling that they've got something scripted to say. If somebody were to contact them and ask them.
You do get into in the film some what ifs. I mean, what if there's solid evidence enough to the point where a government agency acknowledges on the record that Bigfoot creatures exist out there, that they're so rare? What would happen? I mean, Endangered Species Act comes into effect. You'd probably set off a stampede by hunters who want to shoot one. In fact, you do get into in your movie the Bigfoot bounty aspects of it. We're going to take a break now. When we come back, I want to, in our final segment, get into those questions, the what ifs, and the idea of a bounty, and whether people are going to try to take advantage of that. We're talking with Tobe Johnson and Brett Eichenberger about A Flash of Beauty, their Bigfoot film. A lot of ground still to cover, some strange aspects of the Bigfoot legend, and our own human interaction. There's a $3 million bounty that's been offered for Bigfoot. I don't know if that's dead or alive. You can bet there's some hunter out there that would love to go ahead and shoot one, would make themselves famous. If they were ever discovered, would they become declared an endangered species? Would that mean vast areas of the forest would be off limits to humans? A lot of implications that are explored in this film that we'll get into right after this in our final segment of Coast to Coast AM. Brett and Tobe, one of our listeners has been hanging on the phone for quite a while. He's Mike in Fairbanks, who has a story of a Bigfoot encounter. Hi, Mike. Welcome to Coast. Tell us your story.
Oh, hello, George, Brett, and Toby. Excellent show tonight, guys. The Sasquatch episodes are some of your best, George. Hey, Brett and Toby, have you guys ever heard of Ape Canyon, the story?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, I was just wondering. That is such a great story, but couple things here before I go to this Indian tribal chief story. Paul Broca, an Alaska prospector, he was down on the Prince of Wales Island. Him and his buddies each had their own tents, and around midnight, he was picked right through his tent. So this guy weighs over 250 pounds. Well, he did. Paul's gone now. Very famous prospector, Paul Broca. But this thing picked him up through his tent, and he was terrified. Very, very spiritual Christian person. But anyway, Paul reached down for his .44 Magnum, and this thing was holding him up in the air. He was pointing at it through the tent, but he realized he was pointing at his feet, and he shouted out, "Jesus, help me!" And this thing sat down. But he said he was terrified. He was up all night in his tent, never left. And when he got up in the morning, he yelled over to his buddy, "Hey, did you notice anything last night or hear anything?" And he goes, "Yes, I was terrified. What was going on?" And he was outside of his tent, and there were huge 14-inch, 15-inch footprints all around their camp at that night. But in folks home before he passed away, and I never forgot that story. And then also Little Al I met in Fairbanks, a Vietnam vet. He was hunting away from his village on the side of a mountain. He thought he saw him, and he stopped. He pulled his rifle out and scoped it. He said he couldn't believe his eyes. He didn't know what it was. It was this hairy man standing in the snow up to his knees, and just like you said, Brett and Toby, it started swinging its arms left to right, and he realized he was looking at a Sasquatch, and he ripped that snow machine out of there, and he went back to the village his wife was native, and they laughed at him. They said, "Oh, you saw a hairy man. That's nothing." But anyway, there's a couple of short stories there, but this one story, I met a logger where my excavator was being stored, and I mine up above the Arctic. I have many stories after 47 years up there. I've called in before. But this story is from Jerry the logger. He was building a sawmill there just outside of Fox, Fairbanks there, and his son was logging down in southern Alaska, and he heard a story from the natives there, from the village of Koyukuk. And that's on the Koyukuk River down by the confluence of the Yukon River where it pours into the Yukon. And this tribal chief back in the day, I guess in the early 20th century, this tribal chief's daughter she was an Indian princess. She had never been ice fishing before. It was in the winter, and she begged her dad, "Let's go ice fishing." So the tribal chief took his daughter down to the Koyukuk River that was frozen, and they punched a hole in it. And after a while, she had to go out to the bushes, and she was gone too long. And the chief started worrying, so he went in and looking for her, couldn't find her, but he found this area that had been compressed, like something big had been laying there. And he said he saw footprints that he couldn't believe. And when he went into the woods looking, he saw a Sasquatch, huge Sasquatch, and had the princess over his shoulders. And he chased it until the thing ran away. So the tribal chief, terrified, of course, went back to the village. They got 3 of the fastest dog teams that they could muster. They went after this thing, and they chased it and chased it, caught up to it, and it would take off and outrun the dog teams. They chased this thing for 3 weeks, and they kept catching up to it. Kept running. They head south. After 3 weeks, they lost trail of it, but they were all the way down in British Columbia in the Rockies, close to the lower 48 border. But they never did find her. And I just wanted to relate that story to you guys.
Wow, thank you, Mike. Appreciate that call. Have you guys heard anything like that?
Not to that extent. That is an epic story. I mean, that is one of the most epic stories I've ever heard. Trailing a Sasquatch for 3 weeks and the kidnapping of the Indian princess. I mean, that could be another movie.
Right.
Mike, we have the contact info for my guests on the Coast to Coast page. You might want to check that out and stay in touch with these guys. I think they'd probably like to hear more details, but thanks for that call. What do you guys make of the bounty, the Bigfoot bounty, and discussion about Bigfoot hunting licenses, things of that sort?
The bounty makes sense. I think it's just a ploy to draw tourism into that part of Oklahoma. We've been down there to that part, and it's a beautiful part of the state. I really feel like these are a type of people, and they're certainly intelligent beings. They may be as intelligent, if not more intelligent than us. And so going out and shooting one, in my mind, is equal to murder. And I would hope that when the time comes that these are known to science, if you will, I would hope that they would be afforded the same protection as a human being. And in some places in this country, that has happened. Skamania County, Washington, is a place that comes to mind. Whatcom County in northern Washington State is a Sasquatch. What's it called? It's like a free zone for them, So it does bother me to think that somebody would go out and try and shoot one. And just one more point: there have been many stories of hunters out in the wilderness that have had one in their sights, and they couldn't pull the trigger because they said it was too human-like.
Well, I'd like to think that all hunters would like that. You'd hate to be the person to shoot one. I mean, you'd be famous, but you'd have infamy too.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And so you guys sort of speculate on what might happen when it becomes sort of confirmed or acknowledged that it could be declared an endangered species. What then? How strict would the protections be? What would the ramifications be? No idea.
Yeah, I'll take that one.
Go for it, Tobe.
Yeah, I mean, the possibility of looking at it from the spotted owl angle is something I'm familiar with. Growing up in Oregon, of course, the spotted owl was the endangered species that closed down a lot of the lumber industry out here, and including Washington. And there's a comparison between that and it maybe being a soft disclosure of sorts with Sasquatch to see what would happen. I don't know if that's necessarily the case with what's going on here. I feel as though the mystery behind Bigfoot is so elusive and so maybe possibly otherworldly that there's a comparison with what's going on with the disclosure of UFOs and how we handle that disclosure. So that's where I'd like to see the research move right now. I don't know if people are ready to have that discussion, but whatever is happening here is so strange and maybe so off topic from the flesh and blood world that we need a part two.
There was recordings of this language that you include in the film. I think, are those Ron Moorhead's recordings of that language stuff?
Yeah, yes, those are the Sierra sounds that Ron recorded in the early 70s.
Man, it gives you goosebumps, kind of. It's just that sound it would be really hard to manufacture that, I would think. Brett, agree?
Yeah. Yeah, Tobe's got. I think you've got some more information on that too.
Yeah, well, I mean, it certainly is it's something to behold when you're out in the woods and hear sounds like that yourself. But generally speaking, those sounds are picked up latently on audio equipment after you leave. Most of the time, audio like that or communication or languages between two Sasquatch or more. And most people are leaning on the work of Ron Moorhead and Scott Nelson, the cryptolinguist, that is helping, I guess, semi-decipher these sounds in some way with a Sasquatch phonetic alphabet. But, there's many other people that claim that these, what they call samurai chatter sounds or language, happen all over the world. And so what is that? I've sat at many Bigfoot conference with my booth playing the Sierra sounds through a pair of speakers for people to listen to or headphones, and watched, grown men cry as they say, "Thank God you have those sounds. It validates what I heard 20 years ago." Oh. So that kind of stuff just kind of gives you shivers.
As in the UFO field, as in the ghost hunter field, you got bad apples who make stuff up. It seems like every couple of years somebody comes out of the woodwork and tries to pretend they've killed a Bigfoot. Here's the fur. And it's always some kind of a bad rug or a coat or something like that. It really, the stench it creates will stick around for a long time, doesn't it, Brett?
Yeah, this happens. This happens, and there are people that have different motivations for it. There's some folks out there that are tried and true Bigfoot experiencers, and they want to continue that. They get addicted to the fame or the popularity or whatnot, and they can be caught hoaxing. So, it's just part of human nature. People want that attention sometimes. People really want it to be real, and that's understandable. So you do have to scrutinize the evidence. This is true. And I just want to mention that in our film, we've got some controversial photos as well that when we first saw them, we thought that they might be an individual in a suit. And the woman that we interviewed, Rachel Wilson, stood by her story. She's got photos from an airplane in Western Alaska. And that experience brought her from an unbeliever to a believer. And so we thought that it was important to include those photos because we weren't there that day. And we wanted to tell Rachel's story as she experienced it as much as possible. So you just don't know. I think it's important to try and look at as much evidence as out there. And then, I think it's up to the individual to kind of make up their own mind.
You have a photo in there of what looks like a chimpanzee up in a tree in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, as far as I know, chimps don't live out there. So what's the story on that photo?
That's an interesting photo. That was taken on the Central Oregon coast near Coos Bay. And the individuals that took that photo couldn't believe it. They thought it was a chimpanzee. And in fact, they alerted animal control that somebody's pet monkey was up in a tree. But if you look at the photo in the film, the legs are a little bit too long for it to be a chimpanzee. So that story is one of my favorites because you don't get a lot of, juvenile or smaller Bigfoot sightings.
I don't know what you call this. Maybe there's a term for it, but you show some examples of it in the film. Another kind of evidence is these trees that are twisted into knots, just twisted by, I can't imagine the force that was needed to do that, or what in the forest could do it. I guess maybe a bear would be strong enough to do it, but is that, Tobe, do you consider that a form of evidence that this is done by a Sasquatch?
Well, I think so. It's one of the things that cross all platforms of Bigfoot witnesses, including people that are into it as a hobby or people that are these extended experiencers I spoke of. In particular, there's a tremendous amount of dexterity and delicacy, almost as though they're involved in an art process. And then there are these extreme stick structures where it seems like torsion and bending and twisting are involved in a way that you're not going to see an elk or a bear do that, especially when it comes to some of the more traditional bending type wood like fresh vine maple. I think you're alluding to one of the examples from Cottage Grove where you can see 3 different pieces of vine maple all woven together as the roots are still fresh off of these trees. So, I mean, it's something to behold. Brett had a chance to go down there and see these examples himself, and it's either an elaborate hoax or it's something else.
Seems like you'd need power machinery of some kind to do that to a tree, right, Brett, or not?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is something with opposable thumbs. We know that much. And, there's another structure that's featured in our film that, they're rather large trees. It would take probably 2 to 3, hefty individuals to lift those trees and to stack them up on top of each other. What's really interesting about those trees is they're pointing due north exactly. And, we wonder why, and we're starting to think, and a lot of people think that this is a form of communication to other clans. There's some folks out there that believe that, I think in that circumstance, there's like 5 or 6 trees, and some folks think that might be a marker to show that that's how many individuals live in a certain region. So if you're passing through, that's the census or that's the population sign. This is not something that hunters are going to randomly go out and do.
No.
Because there's just no point to it, and it's not artwork. And the trees don't fall this way. And we show that. We prove that in the documentary because there's no root system. These have been brought distances and stacked up this way.
Well, it sounds like you guys are lifers. You're in it for life, regardless of whether you ever solve the mystery or not. And I'm sure it's occurred to you that maybe you won't. It's like the UFO mystery that's always just a little bit tantalizingly out of our reach. It's about the journey, maybe, than the destination, But it sounds like you're in it for the long haul regardless, right?
Well, on my end, I've been doing it since the mid-2000s, and it comes in waves. And you kind of have to step back from it periodically because other life calls. But when you start getting goodness on your hands like this, documentary points out, boy, you really step on the gas. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to seeing. Go ahead.
I was just going to say real quick, myself, Jill, the producer, and Michael Ferry, the cinematographer, we are now lifers because this phenomenon hooks you in, and there's just no getting away from it. It's fascinating, and I think I speak for a lot of those out there that say that you kind of don't want the mystery to end.
Yeah. Well, I'm with you on that. You're preaching to the choir here. A Flash of Beauty is a beautiful film. I hope people will see it. Where's it going to be? Where can they see it?
So A Flash of Beauty right now is on Amazon Prime. It's on iTunes. It's on Vudu. It's on Google Play. You can also rent it on YouTube. And then we've already announced the sequel, The Paranormal Bigfoot, and we have a Kickstarter going on for that right now. That is going to be another extraordinary movie that really dives into the paranormal, and we start fleshing out the characterization of the Bigfoot as well.
All right. Tobe Johnson, Brett Eichenberger, thanks very much for joining us. Please keep me in the loop. Thanks also to my earlier guests, Nick Brigden and Reed Kirby. Their film, Dr. Delirium, about the Edgewood Arsenal. Thanks to my colleagues there at Coast, Adam Thompson and Donna Walker, Michael Cosio, Lex Lonehood, Dan Galani, and Chris Boros. I'm George Knapp. I'll be back next Sunday night. By the way, this week we're going to be breaking some UFO news that we'll have a chance to talk about next Sunday night. Good night, everyone.